In the year 418, the Visigoths, a fierce and powerful tribe, descended upon the region of Aquitania in Gaul. This was not just an invasion. It was a seismic shift that shook the foundations of Roman society. The once majestic cities of Gaul, with their bustling streets and grand educational institutions, were suddenly thrust into a new and uncertain world. But amidst the chaos, a surprising story of resilience began to unfold. During the late Roman period, public schools in Gaul had flourished under the patronage of the emperors. The Emperor Gratian, for example, issued a decree in 376 that established grammarians and rhetors in every major city, ensuring that the empire had a steady supply of educated officials for its expanding bureaucracy. These schools, often supported by the state, were the pride of Gaul. Even in cities that did not receive imperial funding, local governments and student fees kept the schools running. Private tutors and homeschooling were also common, adding to the rich tapestry of Gallic education. Gaul was renowned for its educational excellence. Saint Jerome, a prominent scholar, praised the education of Marseille, noting that students from there were sent to Rome to refine their eloquence. The poet Claudian spoke of the learned citizens of Gaul, and the Roman senator Symmachus lauded Gallic eloquence. This reputation was well-deserved, as many of the greatest late Roman writers, including the renowned rhetor Ausonius of Bordeaux, hailed from Gaul. However, the peaceful and prosperous era of Gallic education was about to face its greatest challenge. In the early 5th century, waves of barbarian tribes Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, and Alemanni began to settle in Gaul. The Visigoths were given land in Aquitania in 418, the Burgundians in Sapodia in 442, and the Franks and Alemanni occupied the northern and eastern regions. The Roman Empire, already weakened, could no longer maintain control. Gaul was partitioned into various barbarian kingdoms, and the political, social, and cultural landscape was forever changed. Many historians have long assumed that these barbarian invasions dealt a death blow to the secular schools of Gaul. The image of uneducated barbarians destroying the classical culture and ushering in the Dark Ages has been a common narrative. It was believed that the secular schools, which taught grammar and rhetoric, were closed by around 420 to 430, and that only rudimentary ecclesiastical schools, often teaching basic literacy, remained. But is this the whole story? Modern scholars have discovered a different, more nuanced reality. Despite the turmoil, secular education in Gaul did not simply vanish. Instead, it adapted and continued in various forms. In the years following the barbarian invasions, there are numerous accounts of secular teachers and schools still operating in Gaul. In the bustling cities of Provence, such as Arles, Marseille, and Narbonne, education remained a priority. Arles, in particular, was a hub of learning. Sidonius Apollinaris, a prominent figure who later became Bishop of Clermont, studied dialectic and poetry in Arles in the 440s. Another notable teacher, Edesius, was renowned for his expertise in rhetoric and poetry. Even in the early 6th century, Arles still had a resident rhetor, Julianus Pomerius, who taught Caesarius of Arles, a future bishop. In Bordeaux, the legacy of Gallic education lived on. Lampridius, a rhetor, was still teaching in the 470s, and Anthedius, a teacher of music, geometry, arithmetic, and astrology, was active in Périgueux. The city of Clermont also had a strong educational presence. Sidonius's friend Aper and the emperor's son, Ecdicius, were educated there in the 450s. Hesperius, a young student, studied rhetoric in Clermont, and later became a teacher himself. The Rhone Valley, with its major cities like Lyon and Vienne, also maintained its educational traditions. In Lyon, Sidonius recalled his youth, studying under a magister in the 440s. The rhetor Agrocius, who later became a bishop, dedicated his work on orthography to Eucherius, the bishop of Lyon. In the 460s, Domitius, a grammarian, taught in Lyon, and Sidonius often played ball with a group of students there. The rhetorical school in Lyon continued to thrive, with students like Burgundio declaiming on Julius Caesar and preparing for public exams. Vienne, just south of Lyon, was another center of learning. The rhetor Sapotus taught until the 470s, and Mamertus Claudianus, a priest, conducted classes in secular philosophy. Sidonius described these sessions as lively and engaging, with Claudianus patiently guiding his students through complex topics. Even in the 7th century, secular education persisted. Bonitus, a young aristocrat, received a traditional education in grammar and law in Clermont, and Desiderius, a native of Albi, studied Roman law before becoming a bishop. These accounts paint a picture of a resilient educational system in Gaul, one that adapted to the new political and social realities. While the barbarian invasions brought significant changes, they did not spell the end of secular education. Instead, they led to a transformation, with schools and teachers continuing to transmit the classical knowledge that had long been a cornerstone of Gallic culture. The story of Gallic education during this tumultuous period is one of adaptation and continuity, a testament to the enduring human desire for knowledge and learning. The teaching of secular subjects in Gaul did not come to an abrupt end in the 5th century. Instead, it continued and even thrived in many cities, suggesting that the commonly held beliefs about the decline of education during this period might need reevaluation. In the early years of the 5th century, numerous teachers were actively involved in educating the youth. These teachers included Mamertus Claudianus, who was both a priest and a renowned scholar, and Eusebius of Lyons, who ran a well-respected school. Despite the arrival of barbarian groups like the Franks and the Visigoths, the need for educated individuals did not diminish. In fact, these new rulers, like their Roman predecessors, required literate and well-educated officials to manage their administrative duties. For example, a Burgundian king once praised one of his counselors for his exceptional learning, and the Frankish court had several officials who were highly esteemed for their rhetorical skills. The traditional view that the collapse of the Roman Empire led to a decline in education because of a lack of employment opportunities and government funding is not entirely accurate. While the large-scale Roman bureaucracy and its extensive educational system did shrink, the need for educated people did not disappear. Instead, the educational system adapted to the new social and political landscape. Many teachers continued to receive support from their students through fees, a practice that was common even during the Roman Empire. This means that the teaching of secular subjects was not solely dependent on government funding, but was also sustained by the demand for education from the community. Moreover, the presence of the Christian Church in this period adds complexity to the picture. While the Church played a significant role in education, it did not completely take over the teaching of secular subjects. Many clerics, like Mamertus Claudianus, continued to teach a wide range of subjects, including grammar, rhetoric, and mathematics. These clerical teachers often combined their religious duties with their roles as educators, demonstrating that secular and religious education were not mutually exclusive. For instance, Julianus Pomerius of Arles and Viventiolus of Lyon were both respected teachers who later became bishops. Their careers show that the line between secular and ecclesiastical education was often blurred. Even in the late 6th century, Desiderius, a bishop of Vienne, was criticized by Pope Gregory the Great for teaching grammar and secular literature, indicating that the practice of combining secular and religious education continued. The transformation of educational institutions over time reflects the changing needs of society. While the late Roman secular schools were primarily funded and supported by the imperial administration, the schools in the post-barbarian period were more likely to be supported by local communities and the church. This shift did not mean that secular education disappeared. Rather, it evolved to meet the new social and political realities. In the early 7th century, the educational landscape in Gaul was different from what it had been in the 5th century, but the teaching of secular subjects remained a vital part of society. The continuity of education, even in the face of significant political and social changes, suggests that the decline of secular education was not as dramatic as previously thought. Instead, it was a gradual transformation that adapted to the New World Order. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church played a central role in the lives of people, serving not just as a place of worship, but also as a primary source of education. For most laymen and women who could not read or write, the liturgy, the rituals and ceremonies of the Church was their main way of learning about their faith. This chapter explores how the liturgy functioned as a school, teaching important lessons about Christianity through sensory experiences and communal practices. The liturgy was a holistic experience that engaged the entire person, mind, body, and soul. Unlike modern education, which often focuses on reading and intellectual understanding, the medieval liturgy taught through actions, sounds, and sights. People learned by participating in the rituals, which involved standing, kneeling, bowing, and making the sign of the cross. These physical actions were not just formalities, they were ways of internalizing the teachings of the faith. For example, kneeling during certain parts of the Mass symbolized humility and reverence, while making the sign of the cross was a way of affirming one's belief in the Trinity. The senses played a crucial role in this educational process. The liturgy was a multisensory experience. People heard the music and the chanting of prayers, smelled the incense, and saw the candles and the elaborate decorations of the church. The priest's actions, such as kissing the altar and elevating the host, were also significant. These visual and auditory elements helped to create a profound emotional connection to the faith. For instance, the elevation of the host, which became more prominent in the 13th century, was a moment of intense focus for the congregation, who would watch with great anticipation as the bread was raised, symbolizing the presence of Christ. The liturgy was also a communal experience. People attended Mass and other services together, forming a community of believers. Religion was not a solitary activity, but something shared with others. This sense of community was reinforced by the physical presence of the congregation, the collective responses during the liturgy, and the shared participation in rituals like the Eucharist. The building of grand cathedrals and the popularity of religious confraternities and plays further emphasized the communal aspect of medieval faith. Through the liturgy, medieval people learned three fundamental lessons about their faith: the presence of the divine, the emotional impact of religion, and the importance of response. First, the liturgy taught the living, physical presence of God, Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Relics, physical remains, or objects associated with holy figures were placed in altars and churches, creating a sense that these saints were present and could be approached. Pilgrims traveled to these sites to be near the saints, believing that their presence could bring miracles and blessings. The Virgin Mary, in particular, was seen as a powerful intercessor, and her presence was felt through statues, images, and stories of her miracles. Second, the liturgy cultivated a deep emotional connection to the faith. The music, the incense, and the rituals evoked strong feelings of awe, reverence, and joy. These emotions were not just personal, but were shared by the entire congregation. For example, the emotional power of liturgical music could move people to tears, as described by St. Augustine, who wept while listening to the liturgical songs in Ambrose's church in Milan. Finally, the liturgy taught that faith required a response. The physical actions and the communal participation in the rituals were ways of demonstrating one's commitment to the faith. People learned that their actions and attitudes mattered, and that they were expected to live according to the teachings of the Church. The liturgy was not just a passive experience, but an active one, where believers were called to engage with their faith in a meaningful way. In the Middle Ages, the liturgy was more than just a religious service. It was a school where people learned the core principles of their faith through their bodies, their senses, and their community. This form of education was accessible to all, regardless of their ability to read or write, and it shaped the religious understanding and practices of medieval society. In the medieval world, the Mass and the liturgy held a central place in the spiritual lives of the people. It was through these sacred services that the faithful experienced the presence of Christ and the saints in a very real and tangible way. This belief in the immanence of the divine had a profound impact on medieval culture, influencing not only religious practices but also literature and art. Christ was understood to be present in the Mass, and from early on, the Blessed Sacrament was kept in churches for the faithful to visit and pray before. This belief extended beyond the Eucharist to the entire liturgy, where Christ was seen as actively participating in the service. For example, in St. Anthony's life, it was said that Christ spoke directly to the faithful through the Gospel readings, making the divine presence felt in a personal and direct manner. One of the most vivid examples of this belief is found in Dante's Inferno. In a scene from Canto the 12th, a centaur points out Guy de Montfort, a sinner who had killed a man in church, on God's bosom during the Mass. This vivid imagery underscores the sacredness of the Church and the Mass, where the presence of God was not just a spiritual concept, but a physical reality. The belief in the divine presence also led to the development of liturgical and semi-liturgical dramas. These dramas, which began in Latin and later in vernacular languages, drew the faithful into the biblical narratives. For instance, the Quem Quiritis trope, which reenacted the Easter story, allowed the audience to witness the resurrection as if they were present at the event. The empty tomb and the risen Christ were shown to the people, creating a powerful emotional and spiritual experience. Medieval literature and drama often emphasized the direct presence of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints in the Church. One of the most famous accounts is the conversion of Saint Francis of Assisi. While kneeling in the San Damiano Chapel, Francis heard Christ speak to him from the crucifix, commanding him to repair the church. This personal encounter with Christ transformed Francis's life and led him to a life of service and devotion. In the romance La Quest del Saint Graal, the quest of the Holy Grail, the presence of the divine is depicted in a striking way. During the Mass, Lancelot sees the Trinity above the priest's hands, and in another scene, the crucified Christ rises from the Holy Grail, speaking directly to the knights. These mystical experiences underscore the belief that the divine was not just a distant concept, but a living presence in the liturgy. The presence of the Virgin Mary and the saints was also a common theme in medieval stories and miracle plays. One such story by Gautier de Coens tells of a young knight who, after praying 150 Ave Maria prayers in a chapel, is visited by the Virgin herself. She appears to him, questioning whether the woman he loves is more beautiful than she is, and offers him her own love. Overwhelmed by her beauty and grace, the knight renounces his former love and becomes a devoted follower of the Virgin. This story illustrates how the faithful expected and experienced the direct intervention of the divine in their lives. The liturgy also played a crucial role in fostering emotional and affective responses to the divine. Easter dramas, for example, were designed to move the audience from the sorrow of Christ's death to the joy of the resurrection. Two emotions in particular were emphasized: love and gratitude. In Chaucer's Prioress's Tale, a young boy sings the Marian antiphon Almer Redemptoris Mater out of his love for the Virgin. Even after he is killed by those who are offended by his singing, he continues to sing the antiphon, moved by the Virgin's promise to take his soul to heaven. This story highlights how the liturgy was a means of expressing deep love and devotion to the divine. Gratitude was another key emotion. Many medieval songs, such as those found in Carlton Brown's collections of religious lyrics, were expansions of liturgical texts expressing thankfulness to God, the Virgin, and the saints. The Italian laud, such as Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Sun, are prime examples of this tradition, where the faithful expressed their gratitude and praise through song. The liturgy was not just a passive experience. It called for active participation and response from the faithful. This response could take many forms, from imitating the lives of Christ and the saints to performing acts of charity and pilgrimage. In the tale Del Tumbir Noster Dame, Our Lady's Tumbler, a minstrel who has joined a monastery feels guilty for not being able to read or sing the liturgy. He decides to offer his only skill tumbling to God and the Virgin. His performance, filled with love and effort, is so powerful that the Virgin appears to mop his brow, accepting his unique form of worship. This story illustrates how the liturgy encouraged the faithful to find their own ways to serve and honor God. The 13th century Cantigas de Santa Maria by Alfonso the Wise is another example of this active response. Alfonso presents himself as the Virgin's troubadour, offering his songs and miracle stories as a gift of thanks for her kindness. Many of the stories in the Cantigas express gratitude to the Virgin for her mercy and compassion, particularly towards sinners. Joan of Arc, a 15th century figure, provides a historical example of the liturgy's formative influence. Despite being illiterate, Joan's religious life was deeply rooted in the liturgy. She attended Mass frequently, loved the Angelus and Compline, and often went to nearby chapels to pray. Her army, which she led to Orleans, sang the liturgical hymn, Veni Creator, as they marched. Joan's life and actions, though extraordinary, reflect the liturgical education and piety that were common in medieval times. While it is often said that Christianity is a religion of the book, this statement needs to be qualified when considering the medieval period. For the average Catholic, the liturgy was the primary means of religious education. The liturgy taught the faithful about their faith, praised God, and fostered a deep emotional and affective response to the divine. Even after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which introduced more systematic catechesis, the liturgy remained the central mode of religious instruction and experience. In this way, the liturgy shaped the religious life of medieval people, providing them with a means to experience the divine presence, express their love and gratitude, and respond actively to their faith. The story of how the Church educated its clergy before the Council of Trent is a long and complex one, often overshadowed by the more famous seminary reforms established by Trent. However, a closer look reveals that the roots of these reforms were deeply embedded in medieval practices, some of which date back to the early Church. During the early centuries, bishops played a crucial role in the education of their clergy. Eusebius of Vercelli, Augustine of Hippo, and Isidore of Seville each established small communities in their homes where young men could live and study. Augustine's monastery for clerics in Hippo was particularly successful, producing not only priests but also several bishops. These early forms of education were more informal, focusing on practical skills like reading, chanting, and administering the sacraments, rather than on formal theological studies. As the Church grew, local councils like those in Vaison and Toledo began to formalize these practices. They recognized the bishop's house as a place of training, where young men could live and study under the bishop's guidance. By the 7th century, similar episcopal schools existed in various cities across Gaul and Spain. These schools, while lacking a standardized curriculum, emphasized practical training and moral formation, preparing young men for their roles as parish priests. The Carolingian period saw a further development of these educational models. Crodgang of Metz, for example, established a more systematic approach to clerical training, combining monastic discipline with apostolic goals. The Carolingian renewal also led to the creation of palace schools, which trained young men for both clerical and civil positions. However, these schools were primarily aimed at producing elite ministers rather than the average parish priest. The investiture controversies of the 11th century and the subsequent papal reforms under Gregory VII marked a significant shift. As the Church sought to distinguish itself from secular authorities, cathedral schools became more prominent as places dedicated solely to training future clergy. The Third and Fourth Lateran Councils further solidified this trend. Lateran III, 1179, and Lateran IV, 1215, both mandated that bishops provide education for their clergy, either personally or through a delegate. Lateran IV also required the appointment of a theologian to teach scripture and practical matters related to pastoral care. Despite these efforts, the education of parish priests in the late Middle Ages remained a mixed bag. While some priests received advanced training at universities, many others, especially in rural areas, did not. The cost, effort, and distance involved in urban education meant that most parish priests learned their trade through local, often informal means. This led to a wide variation in the quality of clerical education, with some priests being well prepared and others lacking the necessary skills and knowledge. The Council of Trent, in its 23rd session, built upon these medieval traditions but introduced more detailed and systematic plans for clerical education. The seminaries established by Trent were innovative in their structure and organization, but they were also a return to the ancient practice of grouping candidates for the priesthood around their bishop for moral and intellectual formation. In summary, the education of the clergy before Trent was a diverse and evolving process, shaped by the needs of the Church and the resources available. While the seminaries of Trent represented a significant advancement, they were rooted in the medieval legacy of clerical formation, a legacy that emphasized the bishop's role in training and guiding the next generation of priests.